Hey followers of TT Elect, this video is actually an interesting one. It's going to be in parts. You're going to mostly be seeing a scientist. He's many things, to be honest with you. He's an archaeologist. He knows many things, right? He's studied a lot of things through life. He's a thinker. Recently, I was told by my very mother, mankind can say my mother gave me life because I was born through her, alright? But in reality, the very one who gave me apparently life has recently told me that I think too much and that thinking too much leads to madness. In reality, we were made to just work our jobs, pay our dues, and just, that's it. Stop thinking too much, right? And I was like, no. It's because we have stopped thinking that we no longer see publicly people like the emperors in the past who conquered things, right? Instead, we see it in the shadows, how, for example, if you guys look at what's actually happening in Hawaii, it's the most beautiful places in Hawaii being burned up so that then people with money can come and rebuild. Like, we really need to think of it and look at it like this. Conquerors still exist. Hitlers still exist. The thing is, it's all in shadows. And this is why Jesus Christ needs to come back, okay? This is why thinkers need to wake up. Because in reality, the more you think, the more you realize we need God. The more we realize we are not God. As much as we think we could save people with charities, as much as we think we could help by going overseas and building a few houses, I'm telling you right now, you're not even scratching the surface of the wickedness out there that you are trying to change. Going back to what my mother said and stop thinking, right? Stop being a thinker, a pioneer practically, innovative, okay? God has recently shown me this scientist that I'm telling you guys about, this archaeologist, okay? And he confirms everything he's ever spoken through me to you guys, even on TT Elect and other things such as my Facebook page years before that. He confirms everything to a T, to the point where even the scientist thinks he knows the fullness of his knowledge. But the Bible says he who thinks he knows doesn't know as much as he should. And this counts as me as well. If I think I know things, I don't know as much as I should. That should push us to seek God even more, because what is that I don't know, that I should be knowing? And to do that, guys, you need to be able to think. You need to think for yourselves. And this is what it is to even just love yourself, okay? How can you have a relationship with anybody if you don't even have a relationship with who you are? And by who you are, I mean, what do you believe in? What do you stand for? So, no hate to my mother, no hate to the human beings out there who only live off of what they see is in front of them. But God speaks to me in ways where even science aligns with what I'm saying, and my many babbles that people claim is without point. But at the end of the day, my point of me speaking to you is not to tell you history or even what's to come. It's the right now. I need you guys to realize the right now is so important because of what has happened and what is to come. So your now is so much more important because it dictates what will happen, and the past dictates and shows you what can happen, with many people either obeying God in the past or disobeying God in the past. It's your turn to decide what your story will turn out to be. Anyways, check out this scientist, this archaeologist, alright guys, and try to piece in and figure out where you've heard what he's saying in my videos. And if you've never watched my videos, go binge watch, and it'll all make sense. God bless you guys.
I remember being like 8 years old or 9 years old, and asking another kid, being like, hey, did you know that we're on a planet that's flying through space, and that if you look up there, you're looking at basically an entire star that's shining and giving us light? I remember kids being like, what?
Yeah.
Like, they didn't understand, and I felt like I was never understood.
Did you go through a period where you lost that a little bit?
Yeah.
Ask those questions?
I think that's a pretty common thing. I didn't totally lose it, but I think you look at the education system, and like you and I were talking about last night, with the whole Carl Sagan discussing how kids hit a certain age. What was that, third grade or
something? And maybe it was like kindergarten or something.
And because of the way that things are designed, imagination and thinking outside the box and all those questions, like that's really not promoted, or in many ways it's almost scolded in some people.
Yes.
I remember being in class and asking a lot of questions and having the teacher eventually like, be quiet, or just like stop asking questions. And so part of it started to, like you said, it deludes a little bit, right? You're like, what am I doing? Like, am I like the one that's really weird and I should be more like them? But eventually I really never conformed to that. Instead, I just started going out in the wilds and like hiking and going out into nature, and I didn't conform. I just sort of ran away from the world is the best way to describe it. And I think a lot of people listening to this that will probably relate to that.
Sure.
Is having difficulty, and there's this core inside you that doesn't want to conform. No matter what happens, it's like there's something inside us. Some of us are very, very strong with that, and I never did. But because of that, I didn't have very many friends. To make a long story short, it set me up for this place of being a very inquisitive person and wanting to know more. People talk about what is that spark that sends you off on a completely different path in life, where you start then questioning everything else. And I was primed for that moment, because when I read that book, it's one of those moments where you sit it down and you just sort of stare up and you're like, what the hell? Like, because then all of a sudden your brain has to reformat. It's a lot harder than people, I think, just think it is. When you're taught everything in your life about everything in a certain way, and your teachers and your parents, to change a paradigm of our entire history, who we are, influence potentially the stars, that's a big shift, because it shifts your whole brain into different thinking. What we find is that there was an obsession in the ancient world over bloodlines. And I mean like an obsession. We talked last night about how the Egyptians in the Book of the Dead would be obsessed with this idea of a being that was a ruler that they thought was like a descendant of the gods, that they would go through processes to try to bring that soul back in after it died to rule again. That's how obsessed they were. They saw it as being something, and I don't want this to come across as being some kind of a racial or superior thing. All people on earth are amazing and beautiful. They had the opinion that there were gifts within those bloodlines that connected to these ancient Anunnaki Anuna gods of Sumer, to lay it out there. They believed that the kings and rulers there were descendants of them. Some of the weird things we have evidence to support that, though, is that some of the lengths of reigns they list commonly, and not just in one tablet, but many, many tablets, that some of them ruled for like 1,000 years.
Is it possible that like there's some sort of mistake in the dating going on there, or their system could have been different in how they measured that?
I don't believe so when you read the tablets, because they talk about it. They talk about how humans used to almost be immortal.
All right, here's another one.
Yeah.
So like you look in North Korea right now, where they're brainwashed. They know that like their former supreme leader is dead, right? But their current supreme leader, his son, is alive. The grandfather and the father are dead. But the idea of the grandfather and the father live on as like a deity saint. And so I don't know. I'm not North Korean. I don't know what it's like to be brainwashed like that. But perhaps there are people there who, in a way, view them as this living spirit or whatever.
Okay.
And if they were writing down their history that was found 1,000,000 years from now, and I don't even think they're allowed to do that. But if they were, perhaps it could be mistaken that like Kim Jong-il, the father, was alive for the next 1,000 years.
Totally get that. And I think the reason we see that is because they're trying to mimic things. It's weird. It seems like the later groups that came tried to have the mindset and do some of the things that the earlier groups could do, and they couldn't do it. Oh, imagine you had a society that wasn't structured around materialism. I just want to throw it out there. Why do we need a phone?
To connect us to other people.
Okay, now we don't go talk to anybody, and we don't go talk to our neighbors. We now have connected to a whole other group of people around the world, but we've disconnected from most people around us.
I see what you're saying.
They believed that the inherent core of what makes us the strongest we can is by protecting certain values. The values were people that were unique had to be identified and encouraged. So they had these great mystery schools, Egypt and Peru, all these places. And what they would do is they would identify people that are unique and special, and they would try to encourage the gifts within them to reach like almost like superhuman abilities, telekinesis, psychic abilities, things that we don't understand now. They created temples in very specific energetic spots on the earth to align to the stars and the cosmos for like a portal between the stars. I'm telling you, we think they were primitive, but they just had a completely different mindset than we did.
It sounds like they're more or less the things across a large scale of our population that we're focused on, like you put the term materialism on it. I'll take it a step farther.
Sure.
The things we're focused on are earthly. The things they're focused on are otherworldly.
They were obsessed with this hermetic concept, like obsessed, which is this concept of as above, so below. It's called the law of correspondence. They believed that if you created a structure on Earth that mimicked the stars, you could harness the energy and power of the universe. I don't think we understand how. For instance, Graham's got this great theory that he says where he believes, Graham Hancock, where he believes that the Egyptians showing the Milky Way constellation in Orion, they believe that the path of the souls through death and incarnation was through the Milky Way, but specifically through the belt stars of Orion.
Essentially, what you're telling me is that these people who perhaps didn't have things like the iPhone or something like that were thinking way ahead of that, though, because that's type 0 type shit, to harness the power of the sun that they could then use for their purposes to become intergalactic.
I think as someone who wants to know the truth, looks at this in a lens that they're not looking at all. Because it's 1970s and 80s, and this is all myth and it's not real. Remember?
Yeah.
And that's very important to point out. They're academics. You have to. I understand.
What do you mean you have to?
If you were to read these tablets and be like, I think these were really cities that were actually real and they're from like an older time period, no.
Because it gets shut down.
The body of history that exists right now is extremely controlled. Everything fits into a 6,000-year window. None of these advanced civilizations or anything we're talking about exists.
That is such a disgrace. I mean,
Yes.
I just, God, the stupidity of smart people. I will never understand it. It's not to say that a guy like you or other people looking at this stuff can't find evidence that is then later refuted by better evidence. That's
Yeah.
the whole fucking point. I don't understand. Like, it pisses me off when I hear about scientists in anything, whatever it is, historians, the academics, I'm sorry, not scientists, the academics that shut down debate or shut down like the entrance of new things because it's got to be peer review. Fuck your peer review. Fuck your peer review. Especially in today's world, where, I'm sorry I'm going off right here, but this, I think about this a lot. Like, especially in today's world where there is ultimate access to so many things through the click of a button, where people can go and actually review things for themselves. There's going to be people who actually discover things. You were telling a story earlier about, was it Socrates was poisoned by his own people for speaking out?
Yeah, his government. He was speaking out where he was not supposed to,
But
know?
still, some asshole who knew shit about fuck decided to murder that guy because they didn't like what he said and they had power. What's different now?
And he's one of the smartest, most enlightened men that ever lived in history, and they killed him.
That's
why Plato did what he did, remember? So he wove it into, put it into an allegorical story so that people would, like, the truth would be preserved, but also they would think it's an allegory and it's not real. He's brilliant. Like, he did it so that he could be preserved. He had to do that. That's how the story went.
It's history repeating itself.
Plato was so worried.
Yeah.
Well, it's about to get worse.
How?
Imagine you go to school and you work really hard to be an archaeologist. Like, you're in debt financially or whatever, you blah, blah, blah. You get to go to these sites, you're digging around. If you even speak up about an alternative theory or something that doesn't fit, you are laughed out and you lose every bit of credibility. And then you probably would be forgotten in history or whatever, because you probably would be so hurt by that. And then we know that people like Graham Hancock have taken brutal hits from the mainstream academic world over this. And so people think that this is just willy-nilly, like we can just throw this out there. No, like, this is the doctrine of history protected, maintained, and controlled and guarded. That's why people like Zahi Hawass in Egypt will refute any evidence and conversations with like Graham Hancock about how the Great Pyramids have no pharaohs and how there's all these aspects that don't align with what we're talking about. They fiercely fight that narrative. Fiercely. Okay? But that leads to what we're about to do, because I don't want us to all hate on every single academic, because I know that maybe they didn't have the guts to stand up, but it also maybe it wasn't the right time. Now we're at this time where people are open to hear it, and it's building something. That's the head of the Sphinx. If anybody doesn't believe this, like, go look, because there's images of Zahi Hawass climbing down these stairs and other entrances to the underworld of Egypt, and they state they don't go anywhere and they're not of interest. So they know all about this. They know all about these places, and it's just becomes stupid.
Do you think he's a front then?
Yeah. Oh, they hire people to be the head of archaeology regions that will play the game and are part of a very specific type of person.
Or they beat them into subsistence.
Or they threaten them to bring a bunch of junk that they had in their life to be exposed or something. It's true, and it's unfortunate, but it's the way it is all across the world. And if anybody thinks, well, how come this guy that's like 39, how can I discover what we're about to talk about? Because I'm not held back by the things that they are. And I can just go wherever the evidence goes and go wherever I need to.
Well, who's to say they won't stop you?
Well, and if I get big enough, we'll see. It's really weird how, like, for instance, the Earth has almost the exact same amount of water as we do in our body, and how our blood is composed of iron. It's the same core that the Earth spins. We're, like, perfectly designed for this Earth, is the best way to describe it.
Yes.
Like, perfect here, okay? But not in a way where we're supposed to be hunter-gathering or living primitively. All of a sudden, the hair mostly lost off our body. She discusses how all of the traits that would be necessary for us to survive in the way we've been told just all of a sudden vanished. And someone will be like, well, evolutionarily, they don't need them anymore. But No, this happened like out of nowhere. It's not like is a slow thing. And we've also never observed any kind of a primate in any stage of a change over the course of human history ever.
Never.
Not even one slight change where it was like converting into something else. And I'm not someone who's completely against all aspects of evolution.
Sure.
I want to make that clear. What I realize is that based on others is that evolution may be more based on the macro versus the micro. So like for instance, I think that an animal, yes, can develop more hair, change things like, yeah, those things absolutely happen. But for something to be able to, for instance, go from a giraffe or like a whale to us, I don't understand how that'd be possible. And I want to give an example of that. I talk about how in Australia, there's a creature there that proves that I believe it proves that evolution isn't exactly what we've been told.
What's the creature?
The platypus. Are you familiar with the platypus?
Yes, I am familiar with the platypus.
Platypus is the weirdest goddamn animal on earth, okay?
I'll put a picture in the corner of the screen for people who aren't familiar.
It's a mammal that lays eggs that's poisonous, that is supposed to be like a half bird, half duck. It doesn't make sense.
But is it possible that something like that was through evolution and the diversity that it was across these millions of species, it happened to be located in an area that evolved it to be a hybrid type animal?
It's potential, but I want to give it an example for why I think that's not true. Lloyd Pye pointed out this really weird thing about humans. Humans have 46 chromosomes and all primates have 48. All primates on Earth.
I didn't know that.
Every single primate has 48 chromosomes. It has to do with packages of DNA, basically. What they found within the human Homo sapiens sapien was that there was something within our DNA where parts of it had been like altered. Yeah, I'm like serious. And what they call those alterations and those things that scientists don't know, they call it junk DNA. That's what scientists call it, because when they compared every other comparable thing on Earth genetically, they found this small little area within our genetics that doesn't match anything on the planet.
Is it possible that we are still too primitive, technologically speaking, to properly test something like that?
Perhaps, but here's the thing that's weird. Like Randall says, we've been taught everything's based on gradualism, whether it's geology or genetics or evolutionary changes, meaning things happen very slowly over a very long period of time. However, we know from these disasters that that's not true. We know that the Earth does go through periods when extreme things happen. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. Those extreme moments also seem to have occurred with us. And what I mean is, not only take the chromosome thing for a minute, like, which is very, very strange, because how something like a splicing of a DNA or altering could happen naturally, I've seen no anthropologist or scientist that can explain that. It's not talked about because it's sort of like hush hush. The whole junk DNA aspect of this, because we do share like 98% with like a cow. And what Lloyd Pye also determined, besides the chromosomes and besides the human body totally changing structurally too, it started to take on characteristics that were not suitable to survive in the wilds at all.
Like what?
Like, for instance, we're not strong anymore at all. Neanderthals and Denisovians were unbelievably strong.
Right.
We the strength of what we are is like nothing compared to what they are. The way that we have genetic diseases and the way our bone structure is and everything, it's like it was designed in a way to function for a different reason, to not be living off the land, to function as something with like a greater purpose, is the way I would describe it. Okay. And what Lloyd discovered was that 200,000 years ago, the human brain more than doubled in size. 200,000 years ago.
At once.
Yes. Out of nowhere. And then we go to places like Göbekli Tepe to bring it back home to that. They radiocarbon date those pillars to be 11,600 years old. But they find, this is what's fascinating, that when they dig down through the layers underneath Göbekli Tepe to try to like basically give a timeline of figuring out when things happened, they find something so unusual that you're never going to hear anyone mainstream talking about it. They find that at the Göbekli level, that they have this advanced, with agriculture and other things that came out of nowhere. Like literally, there's like a layer where all of a sudden agriculture and all these things start happening. And then the layer right below it, they find hunter-gatherer evidence.
Right. One of the questions there would be, is there, first of all, can you define for people who are, again, basically unfamiliar with this, what you mean when you say hunter-gatherer, and then we'll go.
Okay, just like is today, with all the advancement we have as humans in flying around with jets, there are still very remote places in the world where people have no technology.
Yes.
And live literally like in another world. There's an island off of India that is famous because literally they like killed someone in the past or something, right?
Yeah, like you can't even approach it.
And so that same thing was going on then, but to a greater degree. It's like there was two things going on at the same time, which is so confusing, which is why so much of this is getting meshed together.
Well, if think about it though, too, because sometimes I get confused why we get confused by this. Like human beings are so interconnected because there's fucking 8 billion of us, and like we have technology and can communicate all over the world. Only 400, 500 years ago, guys were sailing across into the goddamn abyss to fucking find shit that they knew nothing about. And when we look at other species, like be it on the monkey side, right? There's different types who maybe some of them don't communicate with each other and don't recognize the sameness of each other, right? You've heard about like chimps eating monkeys and stuff like that. So
they seem like different, like disconnected.
What's to say that at some point when there was a lower number of humans at a much smaller touch point of communication, why they wouldn't recognize a human as another human, which we are literally, I think, seeing when you talk about like those people on those islands and stuff who are just like, oh, someone comes on, like, kill it. And you see this in the Amazon still to this day.
Yeah. So there was, just like is today, with all the advancement we have as humans in flying around with jets, there are still very remote places in the world where people have no technology. The point I'm trying to make is, in the Enuma Elish, he takes credit for creating humanity. Bel Marduk. Bel means ruler. In the Sumerian versions, his father Enki takes credit for creation of humans. The point is, they're competing. It's not like there's one group saying this. The same group is trying to compete to be like the all supreme. Like they're trying to be God here. This is important to understand because it has directly to do with the influences of these regions we're about to talk about and the patriot gods that then created them, because it seemed like there was a war going on with some of them over competing. And we know that because there's a set of tablets called Enki and the New World Order. And in that, it discusses how some of these gods, like Inanna and Enki and Enlil, are given domains and regions of the world to run. I'm telling you, this stuff is like mind-blowing. And it talks about how Inanna's unhappy because she's got the Indus Valley in that region of India and up through that region. And he's reminding her of it's important that she still has that, and teaching her a lesson that it's not always about like wanting more or something, basically, right? But the thing that's like so strange is that they have conversations and very detailed descriptions that to me would have been impossible if it was just planets or aspects of our solar system or aspects of nature. Those do exist. There are gods represented as storm gods and different things, and those are like archetypes of nature. But there's something else going on too. There's something else that I'm saying is where we came from. You led me to this point, and I gotta say it just because it's important. George Smith, at the end of his first book called The Chaldean Account of Genesis, at the end of his book, and remember, this is like 1871. Nobody understands any of this yet. There's not really a control system anymore at that point. Not in history. They didn't understand anything anymore, like trying to figure things out.
Okay, not in history. Okay.
No, I meant in history. Like, for instance, they had no idea where to put this, or Egypt. It was sort of trying to figure it out, right?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
George Smith, at the end of the book, Chaldean Account of Genesis, says this like incredible line. He clearly shows confusion over the Anuna. And to just be clear, the Anuna is the Sumerian term for their gods. Anunnaki is the later Akkadian and Babylonian term. So the original term was called the Anuna. On, or Anu, I've determined is God. And I know a lot of people might not like that. I've studied every tablets and the descriptions of it and the comparisons of it.
What leads you to that conclusion?
They're not as different as we think. We're not talking about it's not a competing aspect where I'm like they're saying God doesn't exist, because a lot of people will get very mad, especially religious groups, when any of this is brought up, because then it's like they're refuting that some kind of a prime creator or source exists.
Of course.
The more descriptions you learn of this Anu or on, which is where Anuna, the word, came from. Anunnaki came from the word Anu or on, and basically it means children of God. They're like fractals of the actual source. And that's why it claims that they're direct descendants or sons or daughters of On, because On or Anu is God. It leads you down to this very, very difficult rabbit hole, because what George Smith points out that's really confusing is that it talks about how they come at different time periods in history. And he says that in the book. And man, this is like literally the greatest genius in the Sumerian history of all time. Before, they're sidestepped from certain ideas, he notices that the Enuma Elish talks about how they somehow apparently came here before the Earth is like it is now. It describes how it was like chaos, volcanoes everywhere. It describes it as having no life.
So it's during one of those periods.
Literally billions of years ago, potentially.
Billions. Wait, hold on a minute.
Yeah,
we just skipped a lot.
I know. I just threw that out there, and how else can we explain it?
What makes you say billions?
Because they describe how there's no life on Earth. None.
Yeah, but
not
why?
even microbes.
So how did it? Because they're God creatures, they survive?
No, they didn't come from here.
I know.
It says
because they're God
that
creatures, they survive.
And I've come to the conclusion that as far as we know of any planet, we don't know of any planets in the known universe that have as much quartz as Earth does.
Okay.
Quartz seems to be, again, all those megaliths they build with is the highest concentration of quartz of any stone they can. Quartz seems to be this resonant energy of creation. It's like we're on a giant crystal. If you look at the silica content of Earth, like for instance, if you go down to a beach that's non-coral based, like a beach of sand, and you pick up a big scoop of sand, like 90% of it's quartz. Because silica is the most common element on this planet. Quartz is silica. Silica is used entirely for time keeping.
And you're saying it's like the material
A giant
creation.
crystal. It's like a giant crystal here.
Does it come back to what I was insinuating a minute ago? Like it's because they're like sent by a godlike creature that they survived without an ability to have anything to eat?
They're not physical beings. They can be physical if they want to. They discuss it as that. Not only that, they can incarnate as a human and be a human here, and that's why I believe we've had great humans throughout history that are like non-human. We are them, but they're like a super version of us. We're like creator gods of the universe. And the funny thing is, this reality has been created here. Seems like the purpose of it is to make us forget that and to keep us in a very simplistic mindset, in a very simplistic type of distraction and doing all these basic things is, I think the whole idea, and I take this back to something called, it's a Gnostic text called the Nag Hammadi. And it talks about in that how there's this jealous God of here that talks about how he like almost hates humanity, how we became so powerful and we weren't supposed to be, that it says he casts us down into the lowest form of matter so that we could be like in turmoil. We have to work our way back up again to eventually become what we started as.
This is starting to get like karmic.
I'm telling you, the whole thing gets to the point where it's hard to like be around people because it gets so deep and you start like it like disrupts all of reality. In the Atrahasis, it talks about the creation of humans, and specifically it says that Enki, you were tasked with creating humanity to relieve the toil of us. The toil. You ready for this? I want you to think about this for a second. It's the most profound single line I've ever seen in any of these tablets. And it's mentioned more than once. It says, where you went, you were to undo the chain and set us free.
So what does that insinuate to you?
Well, in the Legend of Etana, we learned that Enki ended up taking up a role in the underworld. This is where it's about to get even more bizarre.
So now we're getting heaven and hell shit.
They start talking about how they like assumed roles within reality and like could command and control over them. They're not what we think. It's described that they came here in the Enuma Elish and altered the entire planet so that life could start. Right? And then George Smith goes on to say, well, but then they just disappear for a billion years, and then they just show up to create humanity when it's time. Wrap your head around that. When it's time. When all of a sudden, we don't have dinosaurs running around the world eating everyone, and all of a sudden our planet becomes sustainable for life, like on a way that mammals can continue here. Denisovians and Neanderthals seem to have led the way towards something that was like a plan.
How long ago again did they say the dinosaurs?
65 million years ago.
That's what I thought.
And when I get into
million.
my binary work stuff, and I talk about with the dark star and how potentially it may have exploded 65 million years ago.
And you were talking about the initial, a few minutes back, you had said, I think this is referring to like...
Oh, Bel-Marduk.
Bel-Marduk.
Yeah, that's the son of Enki.
Your quote was, it could have been billions of years ago.
Or a billion. I mean, I won't just say billions. I'll say a billion.
But either way,
yeah.
Point remains.
Yeah.
So we're talking way before there were
Time
any
doesn't
dinosaurs
exist for them.
here.
Time doesn't exist.
Oh
if you are a
God.
multidimensional being and you exist in other realms of reality, it's called the fourth and fifth dimension. This is where we're going to get into physics. I wish Michio Kaku was sitting next to us.
Well, this is the shit he was blowing my mind
Right?
with the multiple people walking in the room.
Exactly.
Okay.
What we're talking about is we exist in the third dimensional reality realm. This is a realm of the physical material world. It's the only realm that the physical material world exists in that totality, meaning that time here is in linear form because of organic breakdown. Entropy. Essentially, entropy is the reason why things in the third dimensional reality, anything that's physical always breaks down.
I have a question on this. When you start talking about things like this that get into physics and like the actual sciences stuff, obviously you do a ton of research across history.
I'm not an expert. I just want to point that out.
Okay.
I just happen to know enough to talk about it a little bit. It relates to the idea that there is a blueprint to the entire universe where everything is designed based on these patterns and these cycles and rhythms and all these things. These beings that are described in this that created us, it's described how time doesn't exist for them. That's why they could come here 1 billion years ago and then come during a different time period, because when you're in the fifth dimension, time doesn't exist at all. It's nothing. So time you wouldn't be waiting around like watching your clock. Everything would literally happen only in the moment.
Do you think it's possible that there's some form of a controlled simulation? I actually don't like using
I know
the
where
word
you're going there.
simulation.
The best way I can describe it, and this is very unsettling for people, is that source creation that created everything in the universe created it perfectly.
Source creation?
God.
Okay.
There is a perfection to everything. If there wasn't, everything would collapse and just destroy itself. Everything is perfect. I want to give you an example, and I don't want to get too far off where we were, though. We are going to talk about how these beings are related to source, but how they altered our reality in a way that we're almost like we are in some kind of a simulation. Yeah, that's a good point to make sure we keep that.
Literally writing that down.
Yeah.
and I'm going to say this for all the people at home. One of the things about you, and you and I were talking about this last night at dinner, there's so much history that you'll go through and stuff. So when you do podcasts, sometimes people get frustrated if like the host accidentally gets you off something and you don't come back. So I want to make sure
we're going to
come
back.
If you're going to do context, we're going to come back.
Yeah, we're going to come back, guys. Don't worry.
There's a lot to tie back.
Yeah, but I think this is context we need to understand. It won't really make the same type of understanding or make sense the same way. Our Earth and the universe, in the way that everything moves, the way that elements come together, and the way that everything is perfect. I once saw a statistic, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but if anything in the physical aspect of our understanding of the universe was even slightly like 0.00001 different or something, everything would like collapse and crash into each other.
Yeah, it's perfectly tuned.
Everything is perfect, right? Now, imagine you're someone who comes to visit Earth, right? And you're learning about the biome systems here and the environments, and you're like, okay, so in summertime, spring and summer, the leaves come out and the trees all do their thing. What happens in fall? The leaves fall to the ground. They create the essential components of all life continuing at that point. Organic matter breaking down is the only reason why life can survive here. But so perfect, though, the way that plants do with oxygen and carbon dioxide, and the way that they drop, and then everything grows based on this cycles of death and rebirth, and everything is perfect on this earth, except for us. We are something that's an anomaly. It seems strange, like we're here almost like we're visitors and we're trying to figure it out. And the way that I've described it as is we seem more like stewards of the earth than anything else. Is that we're supposed to be here taking care of it, and that's perhaps why we were created in the first place. This is where it's leading back to this. Because in the tablets, it talks about how there was this lower group of these gods called the Ajiji, and that they were creating temples and clearing river channels in the Euphrates and Tigris before we were here. It does. It clearly states that. It says that before any mankind was here, they were like demigod gods that were doing the work for these like overlord gods.
Yes.
That's the best way I can describe it. Powerful beings that have a great interest in this place. George Smith, his quote is, they seem to come backwards and forwards in time. Here, though, they have a great interest in here. And they talk about how they're always like fighting against the chaos of nature to alter it to what they want. Now, getting back to what we were saying is that the Ajiji eventually revolted. That's what it says in the Atrahasis. It's one of the almost ancient tablets from Sumer, and most of what we're going to be talking about comes from the Atrahasis. By far my favorite tablet. And it states that the Ajiji revolted, didn't want to do work in this physical realm anymore. Think about realms for a minute. They didn't want to do that anymore. It's like almost like lower work. And so they decided to create humanity based on their gifts, but so we could toil, they said, do the work of the gods. So we are created to do everything here. Infrastructure, taking care of the river channels, because people don't understand that. They talk about it all the time, because if you have a river channel in an arid area, the Euphrates and Tigris, and you don't clear it out, it'll fill with silt and you can't use it anymore. So they talked about how you had to clear the river channels with a sediment to keep them open to flow, or they'll fill up with sediment in arid areas. So it talks about how that's what we needed to do, all that stuff, grow everything, build temples and all these things.
Are you saying this happens naturally because of how we were programmed, or there's also some source communication that happens among some of us that allows us this, again, very meta?
Remember the whole concept of like fallen angels? That's it. That's what happened. We're not going to go into biblical stuff too much. I'm just going to scratch the surface because it is the only way we can understand this. In Lebanon and in the area of Syria is a place called Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is supposedly where some of these fallen angels in the book of Enoch came down. Now, the book of Enoch, for people that don't know, was originally supposed to be a text in the Christian text, the Hebrew Christian text, but it was taken out. The point is, these creators did something they weren't supposed to. They supposedly broke these universal cosmic laws that exist. Now we're getting deep. I can't...
Bro, we got deep a long time ago.
There are supposedly cosmic laws that exist in the universe that they're supposed to adhere to.
Which are?
Which are creation can only happen if it's based on certain things. They violated creation by, and I hope I don't lose people with this, but they describe how they created us and we were so perfect that some of them had sex with the women. This is where we get into demi-bloodlines.
And where are you getting, what's the
book
source
of
of
Enoch.
that one?
The book of Enoch. It discusses in other places, but the book of Enoch predominantly says they were fallen, or they became fallen, because they slept with the daughters of men. And that's in Genesis too. They slept with
How's that in Genesis?
I don't remember the exact passage, but it says in Genesis, it relates to giants and fallen angels. It says they slept with the daughters of men, meaning mankind, because we weren't called human beings. We were called mankind. That's what our name is from their text. So they create a perfect creation. It's so perfect that, I mean, women are beautiful. They really are.
100%.
Okay. I happen to
Don't
have one.
disagree.
My wife is very beautiful.
Congrats.
Thank you. That's what they state, that they literally, some of them came down and bred with some of these beautiful women and then created this abominated bloodline that was like half gods and half humans. And this is what angered in those ancient texts. I told you about some of these gods falling out of favor with humanity and then putting us into like basically like hell, creating hell here.
On Earth.
Yes. By creating massive empires in war and structuring everything completely different. And you know that because when they've lowered kingship, all we find is that there's murals from Mesopotamia that show this passing of knowledge. This is what it gets deeper and deeper because it's not like we discovered it. It shows that these Anuna beings in like the Ashurbanipal library. There it is. I want you to take a look at this for a second. This is describing everything that I'm talking about. That's why I know it seems bizarre, the things that I'm saying, but I want people to understand this represents me studying both tablets and murals and all of this for well over 10 years.
Is that an eagle at the top?
Yes. The point I'm trying to make is there's things going on here that are like supernatural almost. There's things going on that are beyond our linear comprehension of just us here alone with nothing influencing us at all. And that has to do with the first city ever created. Again, we're going to go all the way back to where we were in these tablets. If you want to believe anything that we're saying, how about we actually verify with real on the ground places? That's what's so exciting. Now let's take what was theoretical, potentially, and what was mythical and all these things, which was what everything of this was, because it's so ancient, so ancient. Now let's try to see if any of that's real. Randall Carlson talks about how the greatest amount of megafauna, meaning large animals we still have on the earth, is in Africa, which would show because of the fact that most of the megafauna in the northern hemisphere was killed during the Younger Dryas event. And some iterations of that came later, but they're nowhere near what they were before.
Yeah, which is okay.
But Africa,
That makes total sense.
But Africa was largely escaped some of these events, and so that's why so much of the life in Africa is still maintained from ancient times, whereas in the northern hemisphere, everything is smaller. Bears are smaller, beavers are smaller, deer are smaller. Everything is like the smaller version of what it used to be.
Is that just interpretation?
I do believe there's validity to some of these creators of what we're talking about. He mentions how he conquered Babylon and he was afraid of their patron god, like afraid of him in a way that it wasn't like an idea, is what I'm trying to say.
Do you think it could have been urban legend though too? And that's what he's afraid of because he actually believed it?
It's described that if you fall out of the favor of some of these powerful gods, that you become nothing and that you disappear into the history books, and that they call themselves the ordainers of destinies because like we're in a great play, like Shakespeare said, we're all playing roles. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is